Buenos dias. Good morning. My name is Steve Levitsky. I am the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and professor of government at Harvard University. Welcome to the fifth webinar session of the Academic Forum for a New Constitution in Chile. Today's panel is entitled "The New Constitution and the Chilean Economy: A Break with the Past?" ? Last month's Constituent Assembly election sent a powerful message of change to Chilean politicians. Chileans chose independent candidates over established political parties, and by and large, they favored candidates of the political left. The political right failed to win the 1/3 of the seats in the convention necessary to block initiatives in the convention, which has triggered fears among many conservatives that Chile could be headed for radical change. And that has raised some important questions about the future of Chile's economic model, which is what we hope to discuss today. For those of you who don't know us, the Academic Forum for a New Constitution in Chile is an initiative of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, Dr. Klaas at Harvard. It is masterminded in large part by Marcela Renteria, the executive director of Dr. Klaas's regional office in Santiago, Chile. The forum brings together scholars, practitioners, and opinion leaders from across the political spectrum for a high caliber academic debate as Chile seeks to build a more inclusive, more participatory, more responsive constitutional system. This initiative, our initiative, the Foro, is overseen by an advisory committee in Chile, which is made up of an extraordinary group of scholars that includes Professor Sol Serrano, Verónica Figueroa Cuencho, Claudia Heiss, Juan Pablo Luna, Claudio Fuentes, Sebastián Soto, and today's moderator, Cristian Gurrini. So many thanks to each of you. I also want to thank the LUCSIC Scholars Foundation for their support, as well as our outstanding Dr. Klaas team, Marcela Renteria, Jimena Codina, Demet Barra. Before we start, just a few important housekeeping details. Most importantly, the event will be in both English and Spanish. We will have speakers speaking English, we'll have speakers speaking Spanish, y tenemos interpretación de inglés a español.
And we will have English interpretation from English to Spanish and Spanish to English. Some of my Peruvian friends, they said, even from Peruvian or from Spanish, from Chile to Spanish.
English to Spanish, from Spanish to English, just go to the interpretation function at the bottom of your Zoom link, and you can get the language of your choice. As with previous panels, we plan to record this event. You can watch this and all other webinars from this series on our Dr. Klaas YouTube channel. We will be putting that link in the chat function. I think it's already there. And if you have any questions at any time during the event, from beginning to end, feel free to send your question through the Q&A chat, the Q&A function at the bottom. Your question could be in English, your question could be in Spanish, doesn't matter. Pueden mandar preguntas en cualquier momento a través.
You can send your questions through the Q&A function anytime.
After the official webinar finishes at 11 o'clock a.m., we'll have an informal, off-the-record, open discussion among the panelists and anyone from the audience who wishes to join us. So if you like the webinar, please stay until the end for the second phase, open your camera and mic, and join us for a conversation. Okay, our keynote today is going to be delivered. We have Professor Dani Rodrik from Harvard, who will speak for about 15 minutes, and he'll be followed by comments from three prominent Chilean economists from diverse political perspectives. Para aclarar algo, los rumores sobre la participación de Pikachu.
So they will clarify about any rumors about Pikachu. Pikachu is not going to be here.
Cristian Rodriguez Chepele. Cristian is a Dr. Klaas LUCSIC visiting scholar this coming academic year. We look forward to his arrival. He's a senior consultant on foreign investment at the Inter-American Development Bank. Before coming to Dr. Klaas, Cristian served as executive director of Invest Chile, Chile's foreign investment promotion agency, as the head of international trade and investment policy at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, and as lead trade and environment negotiator for the Chilean Foreign Ministry. More than anyone else, Cristian is responsible for kind of devising and organizing today's panel. So I want to thank him. Cristian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hello, everyone. And also thank you, Marcela, and the team of Dr. Class, of course, for putting this together. We also want to thank the Harvard Chilean Student Association, who's been incredibly supportive of our forum, and of course, the LUCLIC Scholars Foundation. So we're already at the fifth panel of our academic forum for the new constitution, the first one after the landmark election of the 155 members of the Constitutional Assembly in Chile. In the previous month, our academic forum has addressed diverse issues such as the new constitution and representation crisis, how to address social demands, the convention's regulation, el reglamento, and others. And as Steve mentioned, if you missed them, please very much tune into our YouTube channel or our website and watch them with Dr. Class. But today is the turn of the economic angles of the constitutional discussion. And for that, we've been extremely fortunate to gather an extraordinary set of speakers, starting with Professor Danny Roderick, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School. He's published widely in the areas of economic development, international economics, and political economy. His current research focuses on employment and economic growth in both developing and advanced economies. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including most recently the Princess of Asturias Awards for Social Sciences. Professor Roderick is currently president-elect of the International Economic Association and co-director of the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity Network. His newest book is Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. He's also the author of Economic Rules, The Rights and Wrongs of the Dismal Science, The Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy, and One Economics, Many Recipes, Globalizations, Institutions, and Economic Growth. Professor Roderick will speak to us today on the case for placing constitutional limits on what an elected executive can do in the domain of economic policy. So Professor Roderick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. It's very nice to be with you. What's going on with the Constitutional Assembly and the rewriting of the Constitution in Chile is really fascinating for an outsider, it's also obviously happening at a time when our understanding of economic policy is undergoing quite a significant change. And I'm not going to be talking about the specifics of economic policy since our discussion is about the Constitution. And so I want to talk about economic policy at the constitutional level, so to speak. So whether there is a case for introducing what might be considered the economic equivalent of political constraints or political restraints on executives, whether there might be similar analogous argument for placing constraints on what can be done in the economic policy. And I think that's going to take me to the central theme that I'll be discussing, this tension between populism versus technocracy in the economic policy domain. I think that the dangers of populism are well known in Latin America, although I'll be qualifying that to some extent. But I think perhaps the dangers of technocracy are a little bit less appreciated among economists. But to some extent, this push from below for a new constitution, I think, reflects the limits of that technocratic model. I'm not going to be talking a lot about sort of the broader issues about what should be in constitutions. Obviously, constitutions involve both a set of rights as well as a set of restrictions. And I think what is particularly important, I think even for an economist, is that a liberal democracy, the practice of a liberal democracy, as opposed to an illiberal or an electoral democracy, entails significant constraints on what majoritarian, significant constraints on majoritarianism, or to an elected executive, that constraints in terms of rule of law, in terms of non-interference in the media and freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, independence of the judiciary, and so forth. And the question is whether good economic management might require analogous constraints on economic policies. And I think that set of analogous constraints already has been discussed and raised in a number of different domains, either by explicit or implicit analogy to these political restraints. So obviously, independent central banks, like the Chilean constitution as it exists, has a clause about an autonomous central bank, but the notion of the independence of central banks is almost thought of as being sort of like a constitutional structure. There is sort of similar discussion about fiscal rules. Even though they rarely make it to the constitution, we might think about independent or autonomous regulatory agencies, constraints on taxation, and as well as constraints that come in through international agreements, such as trade agreements, is essentially being of a somewhat similar nature. And I think the basic arguments for such constraints would be to avoid the dangers of economic populism. But there is, I think, sort of a different danger at the other end of the spectrum, which is this trap of technocracy. Now, I think economists have a soft spot for technocracy because they see lots of political inefficiencies that could be fixed by constitutional restrictions or by rules. Short time horizon of politicians, the system of log rolling or exchanging of concessions for narrow interests, political clientelism, time inconsistency that, what is good momentarily may not be actually good for the same group of people, in fact, for the majority further down the line. And these are supposed to create the usual economic policy failures, high inflation, excessive spending, protectionism, expropriation of capital that has been already sunk. And the generic solution that the economist provides to these is a kind of this, the rule instead of discretion. And that sort of broadly speaking, takes the form of some kind of delegation to a technocratic or insulated or autonomous body as an independent central bank or an autonomous regulatory agency. Now, we might think about these political versus economic restraints by way of a kind of a taxonomy that I find useful. So we can think about regimes that either do have or do not have restraints on the political sphere. We might also think of regimes that might have restraints on economic policy. And these 2x2 box is, essentially gives us a lot of different possibilities of regime types. So obviously we might have regimes that are like personalistic autocracies where neither types of restraints exist. We might have no political restraints, but some economic rules or restraints, and we might call this authoritarian technocracy. We might have a liberal technocracy where, in fact, we have both political and economic restraints. And then we might have a populist democracy where the principles of liberal democracies operate with restraints, but economic policy is unrestrained. I think there are actually sort of some real world counterparts to these. I would think of an example like Erdogan of Turkey as an example of a personalistic autocracy. I think Chile's own Pinochet is an example that I think comes close to an authoritarian technocrat, obviously unrestrained in the political sphere, but believing in sort of in rules, particularly in the macroeconomy and in trade policy, establishing very hard and fast rules. The populist democracy, I think, in my mind, what comes closest to this would be actually Franklin D. Roosevelt, which I'll refer back to again. A contemporary version of that might be Sanders, although of course he has not run the presidency. I think liberal technocracy, interestingly, I think probably the most important contemporary example of that, I would say, is the European Union. essentially with its nearly 200,000 pages of the Acquis Communautaire and a set of economic rulemaking, which is perceived as essentially very distant from the electorate and not particularly accountable. So I think in the economic domain, I think the question is sort of the constitutional question for me is the question of where do we find this balance between a populist democracy or a liberal democracy, liberal technocracy, if those are the two ends of the spectrum. When do we want to have restraints or lift restraints on economic policy? Should the central bank actually belong in the constitution? Or alternatively, when is liberal technocracy too constraining? I think, I would like to think of populism as essentially something that has a quite a bad name in Latin America, and I think probably at the political level there is very little to defend in terms of populism. But I think economic populism is a somewhat different animal. I think Latin Americans, of course, are very familiar with the dangers of macroeconomic populism, but there are other kinds of economic populism that can actually serve a very useful purpose. And so these would be redistributive policies or new economic arrangements or new regulations that effectively reform capitalism and save it both from its own excesses as well as from the sort of a kind of a right-wing ethno-nationalist populists. I think the US populist tradition going back to the late 19th century, which was a kind of a very reformist economic policies, that has sort of, the People's Party in the late 19th century and then the progressive movement in the early 20th century, culminating in the New Deal, I think is a version of this economic populism of the good kind. FDR famously said in 1936, sort of talking, sort of you look at his speech in 1936, where he's attacking the financiers, the elites, the business people, the economic royalists, as he called them, using a very kind of a language that would be considered very populist by today's standards. And he says, I welcome their hatred. Essentially just setting himself up as this speaker for the public, for the people, against these economic royalists. On the technocratic side, I think the issues is that technocracy might bake into the rules itself an economic understanding that might be wrong, partial, or too rigid in light of changing circumstances. Everybody who's an economist, I should say everybody who's a good economist knows that there are no hard rules in economics. The answer to every question is it depends. And in light of this, our sort of the model specificity of our answers, in light of deep uncertainty about how the world works, in terms of the context dependence of our results, I think it's becomes very difficult to imagine a set of policies that might be ex ante specified in an appropriate way. And there's a second political mechanism, which is that democratic accountability is essentially an important part of the feedback loop, that is an information elicitation mechanism to tell us when in fact policies are not working well. If you miss that information elicitation mechanism, technocracy can go wrong. And furthermore, I think technocracies can too often be captured by a different kind of special interest, namely the elite. I think this is largely a story of the post-1990 neoliberalism and hyper-globalization. There's a very important analytical distinction that I think that needs to be made with respect to when delegation is justified and when delegation is not. Because I think delegation to an independent agencies or to international rules can occur in two very different contexts. One is the classic dynamic inconsistency problem, and so you delegate in order to prevent the majority from harming itself in the future. So this is the classic time inconsistency problem that has been applied in the macroeconomic policy context to the risks of getting excessive inflation from short-termism. But delegation can also occur in order to cement a redistribution that arises from a temporary political advantage and to cement it for the longer term. So delegation can, in other words, also serve redistributive goals. And that's much less justifiable because it's a way of achieving an advantage over for a segment of society to achieve an advantage over the other instead of a clear majority preventing a harm to itself in the future. So obviously, the kinds of delegation or restraints that are that arise in the first case are desirable, but those that would arise in the second case are much less so. I think we have, again, in our most recent period, we have indeed a lot of examples of elite capture of that kind. I think trade agreements of the, since the 1990s have largely been driven by the agendas of corporate and financial elites. There is a now increasingly literature, even by economists, that talks about how delegation has been overdone, where a lot of questions and policy issues that are largely redistributive over where there is no clear economic presumption are delegated under the guise of being technical decisions into independent regulatory agencies. And I think even the independence, probably sort of the hardest, the strongest argument for delegation is with respect to independent central banks. But even there, I think there are now increasing questions about whether delegating monetary policy to a conservative central banker or an institution where price stability may be the sole objective, or institutions where even if price stability is not the sole objective, is increasingly thinks about financial institutions as its main client, would actually result in a set of policies that excessively weight inflation fears and not sufficiently weight employment consequences of its policies. So where do I come out in all of this? So I think my first conclusions is that the case for restraints on economic policy at the constitutional level is actually generally quite weak. True time inconsistent problems are rare, and they're often conflated with issues that are much more distributive in nature. So I think this is one way to justify sort of this push for greater accountability of constitutions and policy in general to demands from below that sometimes is interpreted in populist terms. By contrast, I would argue that sort of the establishing political constraints, that is underscoring the importance of having liberal political institutions with the rule of law, independence of the judiciary and the free media and so forth, is orders of magnitude more important. And in light of that, I think my final point would be that there is the risk that too much technocracy in fact, can undermine political liberalism. And that, I think, is in fact one way of interpreting today's populist backlash is that it has undermined the legitimacy of liberal politics, mainstream politics, because it has also restrained what governments and the executives have been able to do on the economic policy fronts by essentially claiming that either actual or sort of implicit rules about what could be done in the economic policy domain prevented sufficient and adequate accountability on economic policy front. That, by the way, I think would be another sort of example going back to FDR and the New Deal as how FDR's economic populism essentially saved the country from extremists like Father Coughlin and the sort of the illiberals and the Trumpists of the day at the time. So let me just stop here. Thank you.
Professor Roderick, thank you very much. I think you're right that in the region we're very much used to dwell around the dangers of populism, but a lot less so over the hazards of technocracy. I guess not in a minor way, because many of us sitting in these discussions are technocrats in one way or the other, right? So thank you very much for those comments. Let me now switch to Spanish to present today's commentators. Nos acompañan hoy día tres economistas verdaderos referentes.
We have three economists, national references. Claudia Sangüesa, the director of Universidad Mayor, researcher of the Center of Conflict and Social Research, and the chair of the Provisional Consulting Advisor to the Presidency and Poverty Pension System. Her investigation and research was on inequality, gender, well-being, economic well-being. She is a business administrator from the Chile University and Cambridge University doctorate. Rodrigo Valdez, associate professor of the government of Chile, minister of finance and chair of Banco Estado, worked in New York, in Chile, and the central bank in Chile, and a doctorate in economy in MIT, and business administrator in Universidad de Chile. Rodrigo Vergara, professor of economy at the Catholic University of Chile, researcher of the Moza-Barramani Center from the Harvard Kennedy School, former chairman of the Central Bank of Chile, worked at the macroeconomic area in the Public Studies Center, and he worked as a master in the Central Bank and has a master in Harvard. They published economic aspects of the new constitution. So economists and a philosopher, they analyze fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the role of the state in the social. Please pay attention to the book they might tell us about today. Claudia, your comments first, the comments to Professor Roderick's presentation, and see if your comments could allow us to differentiate in economy and where we draw the line of the limit between politics and the economic world. You're mute. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I would like to comment Danny Roderick's presentation. I think it was very interesting. I would like to start with the last part of his presentation. Too much technocracy may undermine political events. I would like to start with that because I think the Chilean experience there in that area is key. Chilean constitution, and different from other constitutions, we come from a legal tradition that is civil law, not common law. So our constitution, in the constitution, there are many things that are larger than other constitutions, as the Constitution of the United States, for example. In our constitution in Chile, and this is a comment that I wanted to make, is that he identifies certain economic aspects in constitution as a space for the subject. And this is quite specific. But in the case of Chile, constitution went beyond those specific aspects. It went beyond the aspects of the central bank, went beyond the issue of taxes, and it was focused on thinking on a development model beyond the economic. And the current constitution tries to put in the area of rights a sort of a social and economic model. This is widely established in the from the more specialist in constitution in different areas. We have the provision on social rights, emphasis on current constitution, and trying to establish the private provision in different areas, and not defining the rights, because the rights are defined in many occasions, but putting the emphasis on the freedom to choose as a consumer freedom to choose between public or private systems. So the concession, the provision of public goods in areas where traditionally belong to the state, the government, education, pension funds, social security, health systems, and that area that we are calling it in Chile subsidiarity of the state, and in other countries it might be called otherwise, has made the deepening of the action of the market in areas that are general responsibility of the public sector. And there are private systems, but it is an appendix to this responsibility of the public sector. So I think that in the case of Chile, we had the space of economic that it starts with the property rights and with the central bank, and that invaded the aspects of a constitution in that sense, and basically diagnosed today says that the capture of the elite, and then he commented that it is a danger for technocracy, and that is installed, and the economists are in big problems today because we are being as part of an elite, a technocratic elite that justified a development model. So it is difficult to think about a constitution that is not establishing a development model, because we already have one, and that established a certain economic and social system. I think the challenge today is try to take out what constitution means. Constitution means for all, not for some, and a type of constitution, minimum constitution, something similar to common law, or something more basic, so it would allow the political system to design public policies that has to do with the political cycle, and not establishing again a new development model that is totally different to the model that we have in different areas, specific areas. The issues that I consider more important, and I could deepen into that second part a bit more, is we have the rights, we have natural resources issues. And before this constitution, there was an effort made in the history of Chile of leaving responsibility of the state to exploit and produce these natural resources, and then the government puts this into a concession. And today we have a demand for recovering. There are two main fundamental issues in Chile as the mining resources, copper mainly, as the largest copper producer in the world, and water. which have a concession. I think that is where our discussion will take place, in the area of water, in the area of mining resources. And they're all part of the economy. They're all part of the economy, and that has to do with economy. However, it has a different development model.
Perfecto, no, to be continued.
Perfect.
Pero pasemos ahora a Rodrigo
We will
Valdés.
now listen to Rodrigo Valdez. Of course, Rodrigo, the comments about Professor Roderick, but also I reviewed in the recently edited book by you and Rodrigo Vergara with different topics, as Claudia said, natural resources, water, mining, and of course, the experience as a finance minister. You can tell us about the vision on that. But not to forget something from the list. These business state or subsidiary state. I know there's so many subjects, but at least if you can touch upon some of them. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being invited. It's an honor to be with these noble panel members. I'd like to start with two ideas in regards to what Danny presented. Very interesting presentation, Danny. In fact, I'd like to recommend the book, if you haven't read, Rights and Wrongs in Economy from Danny. I think that I assigned that reading to students who are not economists, so they could come into it. That book does something, and it comes with such a precision to Chile, in which we had the monopoly of the economists, and then there's a swing, fundamental swing to the other side. That talking about economy is something that is nobody cares, that isn't true, that is fake. Come on, we are in a problem. From the monopoly of the economist up to the economists to be irrelevant, I think it's a very complex change. Why does that happen? I think that Danny hits the nail here. We have abused the economists, some more than others. I don't feel that abusing entity in what I have done in my whole career, but I was able to observe, and I be careful with my words, that there's a sort of degree of smuggling of ideas or contraband of ideas that is unethical. We could identify trade-offs as economists. We should understand and acknowledge uncertainty, but we shouldn't substitute democracy in terms of choosing between two situations with a trade-off involved. And I think that in our country, particularly speaking, economists that are, I don't know how to say, but from more the Chicago world, they felt the authority to choose between traders without acknowledging or providing recognition to the uncertainty. The cost is that today we cannot even rank situations in which we have no trade-off and we could get worse in all, like redistribution and income. But they are wrongly viewed economic rationality in this discussion that is very possible. And we think that Chile is making progress to some balance or equilibrium that could be even worse. The second point I'd like to mention about Danny's presentation is to tell you this 2x2 matrix or chart is a matrix in which you simplify the political discussion and the economic discussion. But I think that there are several subjects that we cannot split in an orthogonal discussion. I am particularly concerned what I have seen in countries that advance to very authoritarian models. They started by the economy and they end up in freedom or liberties, let's say. I could say Nicaragua, Venezuela, Argentina, not yet. But I will say simply, I don't think that Latin American Marxism believes in the liberal democracy that Danny or myself believe. Consequently, I don't know if we could really separate two discussions. They start on one side and they end in another one. Even more, If we go out of the strong ideological categories, there's some issues like decentralization with fiscal aspects that are economic but are um, tied to economic issues. I think that we cannot separate that much the economy from policy. That's how it is so interesting, the discussion of Danny. I would like to move to two things that Christian asked. I don't know if I'll be able to do that in full, but let me start by the idea of the subsidiary state or business state that is so seen in Chile. In the book, I think that we agreed that we cannot confuse a government program with a constitution, right? And hopefully a constitution is not involved too much in defining or trying to get similar to a government plan or program. Especially in the 1980s constitution, it was more like the government plan that placed the economic policy in a smaller ground than what democracy should accept. So what I think we should make progress to is trust more in democracy and provide an ample space so deliberation could decide what is the type of society that we will build from the economy. The second point that I would like to make is also like a more general thing or maybe related to the current discussion. I would add constraints to the list of economic constraints that we discussed that are very important. I am really concerned, particularly, and this is also reflected in the book, how can we have guarantees on social rights? We will have social desires from the Constitution, and they will be turned into rights. How can you guarantee the mechanics of that? That is something. Steve is making notes. Really? Latin American Marxism? I don't know, Steve. How would you define Castillo's party in Peru, Jaro's party here, or Nicaragua's? I think we are coming back to the statistics brutally in Latin American politics. That's what I think. Maybe not observed from the outside, but let me go back to my comment. I think that restrictions on how these political things are operated are really the core discussion for the fiscal. Like decentralization, Danny talked about constraints that I think are very relevant and we need to have them, of a problem. That's inconsistency. You decide something, tying inconsistency, and then you will have problems in the future. It's so interesting to see that we cannot put together time inconsistency in the environment things. Environment and central bank need to be somewhat, in some sense, similar. It's the future and the present generations that are in stress there. But I want to go to the social guarantees and decentralization, tying them up with another problem, the problem of the commons. What I mean is a problem that is a standard of economy that somebody else will pay the bill. What I think is that when somebody else will pay the bill, in the Constitution, we need to be in charge of that. It can't be possible that a local government is in debt and the market thinks that they will be rescued from the central government and it will trigger all the fiscal problems that we have had in the first 50 years of the United States or in Brazil in the last 40 years. Just like in the social rights, if the judges are going to decide the standards of social rights, like in Colombia now, that is being softening with this struggle on how they could put the attorneys inside, or the district attorneys or fiscal entities. That said, I think this will be minimalist, not only because it is so hard to get to an agreement, because also it should be. What I learned from the book, thanks to the lawyers that were together when we were discussing, is that the case to enter a constitution is really difficult, and you need to have a very good reason to be in a constitution. So all the economic constraints that we add need to go above a bar that is very important. Those are my comments. I will be open to any debate. Wow, thank you very much. Uh, uh, when I read Andres Velasco in Project Syndicate last week, um, he said the good news is like the convention looks like a country. Indigenous people.
School teachers, shop owners, veterinarian, dentists, a car mechanic, a deep water diver, a professional chess player, and only one economist. Así que quizá ahí también, ¿no es cierto? Un poco el
Maybe we
electorado.
have in the convention something like this. It's not just a joke. Velasco says that constitutional convention looks more like a country than what we see in a Congress situation, and not confusing a government plan with a constitution. That's so true. We need to trust more democracy. Rodrigo Vergara, beyond the comments of this presentation of Professor Roderick, why not talking a little bit about central bank? You declared to Bloomberg that Daniel Jadwe favored an autonomous central bank, but protection of employment and the inflation control. It seems that the autonomous central bank is supported by the majority of the views. What about your opinion? This autonomous central bank, is that a way to put limitations on the public policies? Christian, Danny, Steve, Danny, it was a great presentation, and the comments have been so good too. Let me refer specifically to this question you asked, but I'll be brief on that. But I want to mention some general points in regards to Danny's presentation. I agree with what he is mentioning, that the case for political constraints in a constitution is stronger than the case for economic constraints. There's no doubt. I think so. We refer to it as the first or second generation aspects, and political are first generation. However, I think there's one case also, and something was mentioned by Rodrigo Valdez, for some constraints in economic matters. And of course, according to what Professor Roderick said, we need to be careful. We cannot go so far. And I agree with Rodrigo Valdez. Pendulum is not just in Chile, but going from technocracy to the absolute non-technocracy. I hope that we could get to some equilibrium where technocracy has a role that is, of course, a role that is limited, but having a role. And I also agree with what was said, also mentioned by Claudia and Rodrigo, in regards to be careful about a constitution becoming a sort of a government plan or something that is so detailed that somewhat could limit the democracy debate. And Claudia mentioned that in regards to the provision of the social rights. So in that, I agree. I think we have to be concerned, however, it seems to be too biased to the freedom of elections in that constitution. But on the other side, we see some people that wants to move the pendulum to the other opposite side. So basically determining some matter that is a specific or model of constitution. We need to be careful. We need to leave the democratic debate for that. We were talking about some social benefits. It is good to have some freedom, not to determine who needs to provide that, but not going to the other extreme, not to say that we cannot have private provision. I think that will be moving into a direction that could become complex. I said, I agree that for political constraints, the case is stronger than for the economic, but there was a case for the economic. And you were asking me, Christian, about the central bank. Because of my professional career, I am so interested in that. A central bank, an institution like a central bank, was said, is a constraint to the political power, to the executive of the elected officers. It's just to say, you know, you won't be able to fund fiscal deficit with monetary emission. The mandate of a central bank is a lot more sophisticated than this way. But in the Constitution of Chile, you don't have the most specific mandate, but you cannot fund the state, at least buying first edition or first issuing debt. And that's an economic restriction that is on the executive branch by the democratic liberation in many countries, and in all the countries with a constitution. In the book, we will find one chapter of Rodrigo Valdez. This will be in the constitution. In other countries, it is not. In the United States, for instance, it's not in the constitution. We can have a restriction if it should or not be. But in my opinion, it should be there. It's very important in Latin America, where we do not have other thing than a long history of monetary funding of the deficit, and we still see that in some countries.
I do agree with Danny in this area because of being officials, non-elected officials. Well, we need to be aware of the number of autonomous institutions that we continue having. Those institutions that we give certain power to, decision makers that might go beyond those policies or from the political power. And I've been in different political campaigns where technocrats have gone for more autonomous institutions. But who are we ruling? The government might say, because there are so many autonomous institutions. That's why we cannot have so many. However, and I insist, there is a case for this. There is something else that we touched on. It's the book in the book, and that is private property. Private property has certain rules, certain limits, puts limits to the state to expropriate. Many constitutions talk about the social function of property, in the German constitution and many others. The Chilean constitution has it. And that means that you cannot expropriate, but the point is how you do it. Should it be a law, fair price? And the expropriated should have the right to go to court. And there is a restriction. There is a restriction that is political restriction. Some philosophers talked about this as a basic right, private property. And there are a number of things that we could think about. Now, fiscal policy, should we put a limit to the fiscal policy in the Constitution? Well, we might doubt. What are the restrictions that we could put there? There are many constitutions, European constitutions. There are some that have the initiative in budgetary issues, public expenditure, taxing issues. The key point is the one that has the initiative has the responsibilities accountable, and that is the executive power. That doesn't mean that the executive power has nothing to say about that, but the executive power has the initiative in matters such as public expenditure. This is an important discussion in Chile. Who has the initiative? And if they're having greater initiative to the legislative area, so, and how they balance the powers in this matter. There are some countries that have the principle of fiscal responsibility. Fiscal accountability is accountability. There are no rules. There are no rules, but they do have a principle on fiscal responsibility. And some countries, we can have a certain margin. And another point that I would like to point out is the context to rules and complying or meeting the rules. In Chile, we talk about rules. We talk about rules, and the democratic process gave the Constitutional Convention and the Assembly the power to write the Constitution and their general rules. I will tell you about these rules. It says, the text of new constitution should respect the character of the Republic of Chile, international treaties ratified by Chile that are in force, and other rules regarding quorums, necessary quorums, so as to approve the new constitution. I guess that in this discussion, there is a group of Constitutional Assembly that will not guide themselves by that rule. They will not follow these rules that were established by a political power and voted by 80% by the citizens. So this is an issue, and this is a complex startup because it will start that way. If we don't respect the rules of engagement, well, we might end up with a constitution without legitimacy. Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo. We had some questions and you answered them while you were speaking. Well, we can go to Professor Roderick again, so he can give us feedback on the other comments and maybe make additional comments after hearing you.
Maybe I'll also add two questions that we just received from the audience, in addition to what you've heard from our speakers. The first one from Hector Gaete Feres, he mentions that, or assumes that countries will always be led by elites. And if you agree with this premise, what characteristics should an elite responsible for this leading role have? And the second one, you can choose which one to address, by Esteban Fuller. He asks, what do you think that socio-political trends in recent years have led to the rise and dominance of left-wing populism in Latin America, while in contrast, in Europe, and to a lesser extent in the US, they have favored the rise of right-wing populism? So please feel free to address this, and if it, of course, the comments of also our commentators, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Yeah, I enjoyed the discussion and the comments of the panelists, and I really don't have a lot to add. I think it's been there's lots that I'd like to reflect on, but I think this pendulum swinging between what I would call excess populism versus excess technocracy. So, in other words, even if we were to move the conversation to a point where we understand that there is a problem called excess technocracy, I think that would be a benefit. And also, when we talk about populism, I think it would be useful for us to understand that populism is something with a long tradition, and it doesn't always have the very negative connotations that it takes in economic policy discussions in Latin America. So that's why I said this pendulum between excessive technocracy, excessive populism. It's important to avoid, this pendulum swaying too far. And I think, there is a genuine concern and a worry that as the pendulum moves away from the excessive technocracy of the last few decades, that all the credibility and the genuine contribution that economists and much more importantly scientists have to bring to the public debate may be undermined, right? I mean, this is a big issue about sort of the decline and loss of trust in science and in the scientists that goes beyond economics. And I think there we're paying the price of excessive technocracy in the last couple of decades. And I think Rodrigo Valdez is right. I mean, economists have something to answer in this because they allied themselves with a particular view of policy and did not quite understand that that also meant taking political sides in a contentious issue. And then as the political side have lost legitimacy, economists have paid a price as well. So I think the only way that we can strike the right balance, I think, is by being very clear about that, about what we know, what we don't know, and what we're uncertain about, that this is all about trade-offs. I think that we have to be very careful about when we say economics says this or economics says that most of economics is really about different assessments about elasticities, and whether an elasticity is 0.5 or 1.5 makes a huge difference to what kind of policy you would favor. And there is a lot of uncertainty about that. I think we have to be very upfront about that in our public discussions. I think just to very briefly on the question of elites, there are two interesting questions. So I would be interested to hear Steve's response to the question about why predominance of left-wing populism in Latin America. My answer to that would be a combination of timing, which is that I think well, let me actually leave that answer to Steve. I really would be keen to hear him to say that. And on elites, I think people who run governments, who are on office, will in some sense always be political elites. I think we just need to make sure that they circulate and there's a mechanism whereby they can circulate, and that there are constraints that prevent them from doing whatever they want. So I think and ensuring that economic elites don't get a disproportionate voice in the formulation of policy is the way to ensure that. But let me just stop there.
Thank you, Steve. I think you were asked direct questions, so maybe you can take on that. And also, maybe you can also take on this. Marcela Otaegui señala, desde hace un tiempo en Chile se utilizan
Points out that from a time in Chile, neoliberalism is a populist, and it could open up the concept of neoliberalism in an easy way. Can you explain this?
¿Importa si contesto en inglés o en español?
Como el búbule.
I guess I should stick with English. First of all, Danny, on the question of why populism is more left-leaning in Latin America, I think the forces there, although there are some parallels, the forces driving populism in Western democracies and in Latin America are pretty different. In the mature democracies in the West, it is almost invariably a rural, small town, white Christian phenomenon. It is a reaction of populations that have seen not only their economic status, but their social status challenged not only by globalization, but by secularization and increasing what I would call multiracial democracy, increasingly egalitarian and increasingly diverse societies. This has gone furthest in the United States, but you see elements of this across Europe. So it's a social and cultural phenomenon based largely in small towns and rural areas. And it's almost never a majority of the population. In Latin America, populism, the social structures are much different. although you see a little bit of this with Bolsonarismo in Brazil, it's really not a reaction to cultural change, but rather to longstanding inequality and state inefficiencies. Governments are perceived to govern badly over one election and over one government, a second government, a third government, and much of the population ends up concluding that all parties are the same, that the entire political elite is corrupt and no good, and that it's worth voting for an outsider that promises to basically bring down the political establishment. That is not always left-leaning, but given the social structure in Latin America, it's more likely to be left-leaning. Neoliberalismo is one of those terms, both in Latin America and and now in the United States, that's just terribly overused and is used by the left to criticize really any element of the status quo that ranges from the right to the center left that they don't like. It's gotten to a point that it's almost useless as a term. It does, broadly refer to the free market policies that have emerged and became dominant in Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s, but there's so much diversity among those free market policies over the last 30 or 40 years across Latin America, over time in Latin America, that just to throw it all in a category of neoliberalism is almost useless. And so I would recommend retiring the term entirely.
Cristian,
Sí.
¿puedo comentar sobre eso?
Let me
Please.
make a comment about that, Christian.
From an economic or from an academic point of view, but from a political point of view, it seems to me that it has a lot of power, at least here in Chile, and I think in many other Latin American countries, because it's sort of, nobody knows what exactly it means, but it sort of represents the bad things that happen to people. I tend to agree that it's useless from an academic point of view, but it's pretty much used in politics.
Rodrigo, Cristian, déjame agregar dos cosas a eso. Uno,
Christian, let me add two things to that. I had to teach a class on neoliberalism a couple of days ago. Some teachers asked me for that. I had to read and prepare, and I agree with both Steve and Rodrigo. However, from the moment the Pope uses neoliberalism in his encyclic, and when you repeat that in the left-wing governments in Chile, what does it mean? It's so complex. It's an adjective for things that we don't like. And I would like to add a second point to that. I think we have abused from economy of the term of populism. Populism started having meanings, and anyone that says something that I don't like, I will call him a populist. So we need to be disciplined regarding concepts. We need to have a precise meaning for these words so we can have a constructive discussion. We lost both concepts. We lost them. We need to look for new concepts for what we used to understand for neoliberalism and populism. And that goes to the same argument as Professor Roderick said, between populism, technocracy, and I think that's where we have the fight on. I wanted to make a reflection and a thought, and if we live in a transition, trying to understand the concept, at least in my environment with the people that I relate to, because it's so easy to talk about neoliberalism and from the economic point of view and the meaning for that. The problem is that this is an ideologic concept from a political reflection, from a political thought, and it brings in economic consequences, but it's not only that, and that has to do with the installation of, as I said before, is installation through constitution, that is the invasion of economic aspects in all areas of our lives. And it is something that has to do beyond with some things beyond the economy, privatization, markets, etc. I don't know if I have time, but I wanted to answer this question from Esteban Pool. Why was it so important in Europe, for instance, where Europe has gone to a more populist right, and in Latin America, populist left? I think this is interesting because some years ago we thought about that, and I think it has to do with basically what has been achieved by the European development models. The globalization process and labor markets, and also the poor conditions in terms of poor labor conditions. And the demand in Latin America is equality, is going towards equality, going towards an elite that has been captured in democracy. So in Latin America, they're asking for greater rights, better redistribution, and avoid the precariousness of the economic situation or labor situation. And that's why the more nationalists in Europe take more greater strength, and the people behind all that is the same. Populism is not only increasing public expenditure. Populism is expressed the demands on people and participating in democratic decisions. And that is behind the Chilean issue, the Peruvian issue. There are many communities that have not been heard by democracies.
Rodrigo, I think you were the only one that didn't refer to the discuss of the neoliberalism and how and the political weight of it. I don't know if you want to say a few words on that before we pass on other questions to the panelists.
Yeah, I have to confess that, I mean, I've changed my view on this. I mean, until about 2 years ago, I studiously tried to avoid using the term neoliberalism because I shared the views of the panelists that it was everything and nothing at the same time, and you couldn't find who the neoliberals were. I mean, nobody said I'm a neoliberal. I mean, but it does. I mean, again, for some of the reasons that I think Claudia mentioned, and also the political connotation. I mean, there is, whatever you want to call it, there was a change in our central narrative about how government should relate to the economy and more broadly to society for reasons that Claudia mentioned in the 1980s. And Latin America was a leader in that. I mean, the Washington Consensus came out of Latin America. So, I should say Latin American technocracy was a leader in that. And then, sort of the political leadership subsequently. So there was a significant change in the way that we thought about policy, and that whether you call it Washington Consensus, you call it market fundamentalism, you call it neoliberalism, there was something, and there was something around which I think there was a significant consensus, and that has dissipated now. So it doesn't exist, and that's partly why you don't find any neoliberals, just like you don't find any defenders of the Washington Consensus. Although, of course, John Williamson's original Washington Consensus is quite defensible, at least most of it, but it acquired a much broader meaning. So as a shorthand, I mean, I think it's a useful concept because, we're moving away from that, and what the alternative is not entirely clear. There is a risk of overshooting.
Right. Let me, we just got one last question to you before we move on to the panelists. We have from Paulo Guerrero that you cited, I'm translating, you cited Pinochet regime as an authoritarian democracy. And that brings a thought about the role of the armed forces in the Constitution. He mentions it looks like the guerrilla, which no one's mentioning. Isn't this a dangerous omission? The lack of the discussion about the role of the armed forces in the constitutional discussion. And for Professor Rodrigo or anyone else.
Well, I mean, I think the only role should be that the military is just for, national defense only, and should be under, control of the political authorities.
Yeah.
And it should be, I don't know, you can put that in a constitution, but you should be used for domestic disturbance or domestic reasons for, as little as possible. But so that's not really a question for me.
Yeah, well, exactly. I think it's also especially heavy in the Chilean discussion, of course, and hence the question from Pablo, I will argue. Let me move on to our other panelists, and of course you, Professor, if you will also like to address them. I'm just going to read two questions when I switch to Spanish. Voy a leer dos preguntas y por favor vamos pasando.
I'm going to move to Spanish, and Rodrigo, Claudia. Domingo Lovera says, is it reasonable that in face of the problems that are coming, like climate change, pollution, constitutions are not referring the development model? And the second, thanks to the presentation, Mariano Machado. What are you expecting in technical results of the constitutional process and the level of change that it means in regards to what we call the Chilean model? And some opinions about the results, very little, too much, middle change, if it impacts the popular results that we want as a product that we will see in the end of year 2022. Any of you guys? Claudia, go ahead. And you wanted to mention a comment about the last comment of Danny. No, that's minimum. Pablo that was asking is what's the context in which the Constitution said it was in a dictatorship, and it was not the best context to write a democratic constitution, I think. That's why the original sin in the Constitution of Chile is that, or has to do with that, right? But in regards to what you said that Domingo asked, the thing is, we have so much uncertainty, and uncertainty is also in the people about what will come. Now we see the pandemic, the climate crisis. In general, in Chile, apart from that, we have not much of social security, unemployment, people getting older. It's uncertainty multiplied. So I think there's a huge demand in the Constitution for having this certainty in regards to how we could solve these problems. And I think it is something that a constitution, I understand, really need to include principles more than solving problems in there. I think it needs to include a way to resolve conflict, not just for the now, but for the future or from now on. But it is unavoidable to include some principles to see how we face these problems in the development model, being on a preamble of a constitution or even through some articles in the Constitution that will give a role to a state that is the accountable in decreasing uncertainty. And I'm telling this not just because I want to say it, but let's analyze. If we analyze data of the analysts of constitutions in Constitutional Project, they analyze the evolution of changes and more and more constitutions establish rights that are in regards to the environment, economic, and social. As I said, more and more. So we would expect that to be in the Constitution. But the thing is, up to what point are we aware that it is the political system that will solve these problems? The Constitution will write them, but it won't solve them. And I think we need to make the citizens understand that apart from that writing, we need to do the legislation, and then it could become public policies. Thank you, Claudia. Rodrigo, just a couple of comments in regards to what Claudia just added. Environmental crisis, it implies several challenges, and I imagine that there's already something in the current constitution and maybe some reinforcement in this new constitution that we will have in approximately 1 more year. I agree with Claudia in the sense that the constitution establishes some principles and a specific policy should be part of the democratic debate. And we need to be careful about that. What are we referring when we talk about the development model? Is so broad or is part of the law? Okay, I agree. But we have installed some discussion. Let's say discussions or subjects that should not be part of the Constitution. These are part of the discussion of the policy and the day by day of the democratic discussion, and established that as a sort of restriction. The world is so big to have a sort of a straight jacket that is so stringent and strict. And we have talked about that after Danny's presentation. In regards to the changes, there are changes that are relevant, and Mariano's question. The Constitution in Chile, we emphasize in Chile that there are myths in regards to the Constitution that are discussed, that are said, that are part of the current Constitution. And certainly these came from 1833 or even 1925 Constitution, or even before dictatorship. In the case of Chile, like the specific thing like expenses exclusive initiative that is discussed associated to current constitution, but that's in Constitution of 1925, then with a reform in 1960s, and it comes from there. So this will be a sort of change with a maintenance of some things, but evidently there will be change, I imagine, that could be relevant. Let me react. The development model concept for me is not Ethereum as neoliberalism, but it's almost the same. I don't find that in any macro or basic economy book. It won't be in the classic books. And I'm not saying that I'm extremist rightist, right? So be careful to create from politics a concept that invade the democratic discussion that is informed. Water, natural resources in Chile, we have more copper than water. Reserves, I mean. So I don't think that we need to exercise sort of an overpressure on the Constitution in these regards. We talked about the Chilean model, and I resist to talk about the Chilean model. Chile was different in 2000, and now it's different. There's basic access, education access is the biggest in Latin America. The life expectancies are the greater. We had 1 million immigrants. Why would the people emigrate to Chile? So I think that that's why they were doing it now and not before. So we're putting in the same bag and this frenziness. We don't see 30 years with very fundamental changes. But my concern about the Constitution really is we're missing an opportunity to change a subject that I think is the most complicated for us. And it has to do with something that Danny mentioned about the civil constraints or liberties constraints, but it's not strictly related, but indirectly, it is the political regimes and the rules of the politics. What really affects Chile more than the economic system is governance of everything, including the economic system. My impression is that we're starting to walk on a path without much discussion. I'm radical. If I have the magic wand, I don't know, Steve, I would make Chile different state. We have the presidentialism, so many parties, voting systems that are granular, proportional, and I think they will not change. We will keep the same. So my faith is poor in thinking that we will have a relevant change. I don't know how a discussion that is more informed about this could be done. But what I observe is that the United States is the only presidentialist developed country of the world, and it's so particular case. We're not going anywhere with a presidential system. Thank you. Dear panel's members, we are arriving to the time sharp. I know, Professor Roderick, you need to leave at 11 sharp. Some will stay for the almost traditional happy hour after hour that we classically do with 20 minutes, 15 minutes with the people that could stay with open microphones and open cameras. If you are part of the public and you would like to stay as a public, we will open and we will try to solve any questions you have. We really appreciate the wonderful questions. We had several, an immense amount of questions, and it was not necessary to add our own because of the great quality of you.
Shortly. Any final thoughts? Give us your last 2 minutes, and then I'll pass it on to Steve Levitsky to close the seminar. But again, inviting everyone to stay because we then have some minutes to continue the discussion. I think you're muted, sir.
Chile has been a leader. If you look at the last 40 years, I mean, Chile has been a leader and a trendsetter globally in so many different domains. Not always necessarily a great example, but I think this is now a new experiment where Chile is leading the way. So I think it's of huge importance for not just Chile, but also the rest of the world, that this gets done well and in a way that inspires other people in the rest of the world. And I think balancing these different considerations that we've been talking about in this panel, I think is going to be very important. I think there's, social scientists believe in the wisdom of the crowds, and maybe the fact that the Constitution will be written by people who represent all walks of life and don't over-represent economists is maybe not a bad thing. So it's I wish the process and Chile all the best.
Danny, thank you. Social scientists believe in the wisdom of the crowds. I'm not sure there's a total consensus around that. But, I want to second or reiterate Danny's point. The reason why Dr. Klaas has taken so seriously the process in Chile, the reason why we created this forum was precisely because Chile has often been a leader in both political and economic institutional change, because we think as confused and as uncertain as things are right now in Chile, as intense as the debates are, because Chile has and has long had a strong institutional foundation, what Chileans end up producing is very likely to stick. And Chile there's a reason why the world is watching. There's a reason why the continent is watching what's happening in Chile. We don't know exactly what will come out of this constitutional process, but it is very likely, or probably for better and worse, as Donnie pointed out, to be a model that a lot of the rest of the region will watch closely. So first of all, many thanks to Donnie Roderick for sharing his time and his insights, and many thanks to Claudia Sanjueza, Rodrigo Valdez, Rodrigo Vergara. We really appreciate all three of your participation today. I know I learned a lot.